you'll be like, damn, this guy does not miss.
Yeah, yeah,
He just missed like 1,000 times off camera.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's just like Instagram. Like, yo, I'm at the round table. Next day, I'm fucking like, I don't know. I'm eating like a hot pocket on the couch, and like I stayed in bed for like 7 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, don't focus on like the highlights of everybody. Everybody has had some struggle in some form to get where they are.
The following is a conversation with Kariyu, a content creator with over 200,000 subscribers on YouTube, who aside from their very charismatic and unique sense of humor, is well known for being a competitive player in games such as Fortnite, Valorant, and Osu. Throughout all the experiences that Kariyu has had with improvement in different games, content creation, and just in life, this ended up being a super insightful conversation, and I encourage you all to listen until the very end. This is the honmi podcast. To support it, you can subscribe on YouTube or support me directly using the Patreon link in the description. And now for my conversation with Kariyu. Having been accused for cheating in the past, what lessons have you learned about the differences between public perception of a public figure and the actual truth?
Whoa, that's a heavy question. Okay. So yeah, I think I got accused of cheating. Like it was very random too. It wasn't like I was popping off like crazy. I had gotten my first 400 PP play on like some obscure map, and I didn't think much of it. I didn't like tell everyone like, oh bro, check out my 400 PP play. I was like, okay, cool. And then I don't know. I wake up the next day or like a couple of weeks later, and then there's a report thread about me. It was very like it didn't affect me at all. Like I didn't feel that I was getting like accused. This was horrible. I was like, oh, this is funny. I can totally make a video about it. And that's all. And then I like posted it on Twitter because I thought it was like funny. And people were like, dude, why'd you do that? You are witch hunting this person that accusated you. But I don't think I said anything like, everybody please attack this guy. He said this about me. It was just like I just kind of felt like, oh, this is cool. I got accusated because I was grinding the game. That's pretty sick. Was the question about public perception?
Right.
Sorry.
No, you're good. It's like, what have you learned about the difference between like public perception of a public figure and the actual truth?
It's always very different, like the lens of the public slash viewer in comparison to what like the person is actually thinking. It depends case by case. Like I think there are cases where like people like Matthew can get like accusated a bunch by the community, and like it will get in their head. But in other cases, let's say I'm not getting accusated, I'm sure like it looks like a big deal to him, but like in terms of like what the public thinks, but like for him, I'm pretty sure he could just care less because he knows he's not cheating.
Right.
And that was kind of the case for me. Like because I knew I wasn't cheating, it wasn't a big deal. Like all of like the fuss going on was just kind of fluff. I think that the community of Osu is really unique. Like they are very passionate about the game, which leads them to have a lot of like conversations about stuff that probably shouldn't be blown out of proportion, in my opinion.
Yeah, I especially think interesting you brought up Matthew. I think he's a good case of people sort of misunderstanding your intentions of the things that you've done. And especially I think when you're sort of in the public spotlight, it's sort of double-edged, at least the way I see it, because on one hand, everyone is sort of has their own opinion of you and sort of has the ability to criticize you and make their own opinion, but at the same time, I think everyone has an opportunity to show you ways that you can improve yourself as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like there are times where like someone will like say something about me. We can get into this conversation about later if you know about like the tweet where I quote retweeted someone where I FC'd their top play.
Oh, oh
Um,
man.
that is a whole conversation in itself. But like there were people that were criticizing my entire brand as a whole, and I thought that was like it was like it did stem from a useless like argument about top player, but it was still like it was valuable criticism about my brand that I could use to like improve myself. So it's really all of like this argument that stems from like accusations or like just anything can be valuable. Like it really depends on how you see public perception.
So you mentioned that the OC community is very unique in that they're very passionate about the game. Are there any sort of other characteristics about the OC community that you think make it really unique?
I'd like to double down on like this whole passionate point. Like there are many times where like it doesn't seem like such a big community until you've like seen like the whole BTMC r/place thing, how like exactly united we were as a group. But then, just like any other community, and this is where Otsu is like, I guess, not unique. It exists in every community. There's always like a vocal minority of people that just like to spread a lot of hate and like negativity, I guess.
Give the community a bad rap.
Yeah, it happens with every community. But even then, like Osu is just the community of people, they are really into it. And that could be a double-edged sword in itself. So like the accusations would be like one of the bad sides of the sword, and then the on the other side it would be like, r/place or
I mean, even in like sort of everyone creating like inside jokes within the entire community, and like things spread really, really quickly, and like every single player can sometimes like be in on the same joke.
yeah.
I feel like that's something that's also really unique.
Yeah. I feel like in other games it's very like it's a lot less tight knit than Osu is for sure.
Yeah, I think that's something that, at least for me, is really one of the factors that draws me to Osu, is that being a game where it's sort of all about your own experience and your own improvement. I think a lot of the social aspect of the game is like being able to connect with other players and, discuss your adventures with each other, basically, and just sort of play alongside each other instead of just queuing up and getting matched with random people. And then like whether you win or lose, you just kind of go to the next game and you never see them again.
Yeah, right. I think Osu players just have a lot more in common than like in other games. The common goal is to just like, improve at whatever you do, whether it be like mapping or like playing better at the game or just playing better at easy or reading better. Like there's always like a common theme amongst all of these like topics. It's like, oh, let's improve at it. Let's discuss about it. It's cool. It's very different from other games.
On a similar note, in a lot of other games, there's this element of being able to blame someone else for your shortcomings or shortfalls, or just general weaknesses, mistakes that you've made. There's always someone else that you could point the blame to. And something really unique about Osu is that doesn't really exist. In some sense, the closest thing I can think of is lag, maybe. But even then, I think just by nature, Osu is one of those games where like you really recognize that if you messed up, then it's something that you yourself have to work on and improve on.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. There's like that one exception of like, I don't know, maybe you guys are playing a team tournament. There's a thing called match cost. And you could look at the weaker link in some cases, but
That's true.
I like that. I love the OSA community, and that like in terms of like the tournament scene, that doesn't really happen. For the most part, it's a lot of positivity. Like compared to other games where kind of your natural instinct is to be like toxic. Well, not necessarily toxic, but super competitive. Like it's like if you're playing Valorant and then you win against the enemy team, you're like Alboza. In like OSU tournaments, at least, it's very like positive vibe. It's like, oh, thanks for reffing, thanks for the games. It was a good game. You don't necessarily blame anyone.
Yeah.
And that allows you to focus on yourself a lot more. Like let's get like back to the point. You can't really attribute like anybody else for you like not FCing a map or something. There's always something you can improve of your own gameplay. And it's made a lot more prevalent in this game than others. And that's what makes like improvement in this game so rewarding, I think.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up tournament play, because that's actually a really good point. I think it's a very natural argument to make where, sure, in single player, when you're just playing by yourself, then like obviously there's no one else to blame. But if you're playing in a team tournament where everyone's performance gets added up and then gets put against the other team, it would be natural to think that like you could blame the person on your team who performed the worst for you guys losing that point. But I feel like, well, two things. I feel like one, like 99% of the time, everyone is like, oh no, I got a stupid miss. And like, if only I didn't miss in that spot, like even if they got the top score on the team.
Yeah.
There's sort of that context. I feel like part of it might be because like while you're playing, you only see what you did, basically. And then at the end, you see everyone else's scores, but you don't actually see how other people messed up. But aside from that, I feel like a lot of it also has to do with picking strategy and how like tournament performance is not just about how you played in the map. For one, half the maps that are played are picked by the other team. So if you guys just did really, really poorly, then it's usually always brushed off as like, oh, it's okay, it was their pick. And now like, let's see if we can get a point back on our own pick. And on a similar note, if you guys lost your own pick and some players did really bad, then rather than blaming that specific player, you might either blame your picking strategy for maybe having picked the wrong map, or your roster strategy where maybe you put in the wrong player for that map. But yeah, in general, I feel like just by the nature of the game, you tend to find pretty much anything else to blame other than the players around you, which is definitely a really unique environment compared to most other games.
Yeah, it's also like there's more control in this game in that like you're aware of what your teammates are capable of based on like either like team sheet or like previous tournament performances.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
While in other games there is more of like a an RNG factor. Some people might pop off because the matchup is just like super favorable towards them in terms of like the players they're playing against. But like in Osu, it's more self performance based, and that leads to at least a greater sense of community. I'd like to think like there's nobody that will, because it's based on your own capabilities. Your first instinct when you lose a match won't be like, "Damn, it's this guy's fault." It's more like, "Damn, this is what I could work on."
Right.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, and on a similar note, you mentioned sort of being able to reliably expect how people will perform. And in most other games, you never really have the same situation twice, or at least not in the same exact frame of context. And actually, on that note, I'm curious to get your opinion on how exactly do you improve at a game where you don't actually have the same situation occur more than once?
Now, I'm thinking in the frame of League, Fortnite, and Valorant here. It is a wide scope of games, but let's just say in League, right? I don't know how many champions there are. I haven't played in a long time, but the combinations is up to like a million or something.
Right.
You're never going to have the same game twice. Very, very rare. And the way you are to practice for these sort of things is to mitigate the amount of like RNG there is by focusing on what you can control. I think it's also the same thing with OC actually, but in Valorant, like let's say I'm holding an angle and then I notice, okay, someone popped up on the B site and I'm on A site, and something different can happen each time. You can get flashed, can get smoked off, or I don't know, someone might be flanking you. This type of thing like will play out differently each time, but it's about what you can control, because realistically every game has like an unlimited amount of outcomes. It's up to you to focus on what you can control, just like in Valorant, you can control your spray, you can control your movement, you can control your util usage, you can control your communications. And to get better at games with so many outcomes, it's about focusing, at least in my experience, what I've tried to improve is don't worry about anything that could happen. Just remember all like the fundamentals that you've worked on and execute those fundamentals, and the outcome will become more predictable than not, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah. I actually think that makes a lot of sense. I think, at least from my understanding, like you can never really predict how an entire game will go. But at a very, very small scale level, there's usually like patterns that tend to happen. Like even if you're holding an angle, you said there's like a couple things that, although you can't predict exactly which one is going to happen, there's a couple things that you can expect to need to be prepared for. So on a smaller scale, there's things that you can practice. And then over time, you like, as you sort of develop your game sense and things like that, you can start to predict like based on what strategies the other team has been using so far, like on a very small scale, then you can start to predict what strategies they might be using later on in the game as well. And
Yep.
you can use that to your advantage. But it really all builds on like getting comfortable with like handling very like small scale situations that tend to be relatively common, because even in a game like League, for example, if you're playing against a certain other champion or character, let's say you've played against that other character maybe like 100 times. So you're pretty familiar with what their abilities are and what they do and how your opponent might try to use them in different situations. On that small scale, you might be able to expect, like, if you and the other character are standing in a certain spot relative to each other, then they might try to use a certain combo to you. And getting used to those sorts of combos, I think, is really where, like, you are able to improve, especially your prediction skills on a smaller scale level. And then you gradually build those pieces, or you start to connect those pieces together and start to be able to make more like long-term predictions. And on a separate note, I feel like part of learning how to predict what the other players will do is like recognizing what mistakes some players have been making. Let's say you're playing in like Iron Elo or Silver Elo, then it's like if this player made X mistake, then they're probably going to make X similar mistake that people in this elo do. And like being able to work around not only what people should probably do, but also keeping in mind what mistakes your team is probably going to make and like trying to work around that instead of trying to work around what ideally should happen.
Yeah, I like the analogy you made with the league thing. Oh, have you played Valorant before?
Maybe 2 games.
Okay. So in like Valorant, you sort of I like to like compare this to like building habits. You recognize like a pattern amongst all your games. Like this could be something like super rudimentary. Like, oh, they have a Sky, which is a character with a flash. And then what happens with the flash? If you look at it, you get blind. So okay, now that I recognize that whenever they have a Sky alive, I should get into the habit of doing a 180-degree turn so I don't get blind. Being able to realize that until like it's second nature, I feel like that's one of the fundamental things of like building good habits in games like these. I've noticed even in like higher elo games in Valorant, people aren't like they don't have the muscle memory to like turn away from flashes, even though there might be like two people. It could be like a 1v2 and you're against like a Phoenix and a Sky. They both have flashes. And some players don't have like or they don't immediately recognize like, oh, I'm against two flash agents. I should expect a flash to come out of common angles.
Right.
And stuff like this is
It's like you build the intuition through experience, I feel like.
exactly. Yeah, this kind of like sequence in video games where you like recognize a pattern and then continue to think about it until you don't have to anymore, until it's just second nature is I think what makes a lot of people able to play on instincts, and so they could spend like their brain power on thinking about like other stuff, and it lets you become like a better player instinctually, if that makes sense. Like,
Right.
um, I think a lot of people can relate to a time where they've played video games a while on autopilot. And I think the more you play a video game and recognize more habits so that your brain thinks less, right? You'll be able to become a better player on autopilot. And playing on autopilot isn't necessarily a good thing. It's more of like oh, I'm probably a little tired. I just want to like chillax and, you know, wind down.
I feel like autopilot is a really interesting concept because, in some sense, like you mentioned, you sort of ideally want to be able to put certain fundamentals on autopilot so you can focus on more like high level or more complex strategies in your mind. But at the same time, relying on autopilot can be really detrimental to improvement, especially how I think the most basic example is like you can have someone who played 10,000 hours of a game and is still much worse than someone who's played maybe 300, 500 hours of the same game or really any activity. And a lot of it, from what I've noticed, comes down to really being able to focus deliberately on the decisions you're making and what mistakes may have happened. And whenever a mistake does end up happening, like being able to reflect on it right after it happened and recognizing what exactly you did wrong and especially why that mistake happened. I think that's a question that is often not considered as much as it should be for a lot of people willing to improve, because it's one thing to recognize what went wrong, but another to really realize why that thing went wrong and what you can do in the next time a similar situation comes up. Or especially even if you're just learning, like scratching the surface of a certain concept, you have to spend some time just forming your concept of how that concept sort of works and getting used to like different situations and being able to internalize a situation that just happened and keeping it in mind so that whenever a similar situation starts to arise, you can start to expect what might happen and play around it. And that's definitely a pitfall that I notice a lot of people fall into when it comes to just playing on autopilot in general.
Yeah, for sure. I wholeheartedly agree with you here. There's a reason why there's like people that have played League for like 10,000 hours and are well, still Bronx. And it's not it's before like I get pitchforks thrown at me, I'm not saying like you can't just have fun at a video game
Oh yeah, for
without
sure.
improving,
For
right?
sure.
Like casual players exist and that's completely fine.
Shout out to casual players.
Shout out to casual players. Skins get wins. This is for more of like the people that complain about being hard stuck and just rage queue. I feel like a big mistake a lot of people face when they're trying to improve is playing consciously. Back to the whole like autopilot thing. I had a friend that literally just farmed or literally just played like, any farm map with, the sole goal of getting PP. No problem with that, by the way. Like if you want a PP farm, PP farm. But he was complaining about not being able to like FC maps or whatever, but all of his sessions were just like get on, play maps and autopilot them. Not like literally, but like just
Right.
autopilot in the brain. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna hit the notes without really thinking of like, oh, I missed on a burst here. Perhaps I could work on my speed at like 240 BPM. Now, I don't think Osu is a game where you have to think too much when you're playing, but it's about like focusing on what you can improve on. And my friend was just he wanted to improve, but he was just not looking at the bigger picture. He wasn't playing consciously, and all of his play sessions were not productive to say the least. They didn't work on his pitfalls, and I think the biggest mistake that my friend had was not having a goal of what like skill set that he wanted to work on for that particular day. He was just shotgunning any map that gave him rank. And I think there is merit to like PP farming. I think PP farming is a good way to improve your mechanics actually. You just have to be aware of it.
The term PP farming is commonly associated with playing on autopilot, much more so than most other things. But maps that are usually used for PP farming, which basically is maps that are relatively comfortable to play compared to how hard the PP algorithm thinks that the map is. And so basically a PP map would be one where the difficulty of how it actually is to play it is easier than what the PP algorithm thinks that it is. The thing is that those maps are still maps that can challenge certain aspects of play. Mostly like really simple rhythm type maps tend to be considered PP farm because you can create let's say a jump that has very high spacing, but it's all new comboed in 1-2, so it's really easy to read and the angles are really comfortable. But in the eyes of the PP system, then the map is actually very difficult because it just sees the high spacing, right? In theory. But those maps still challenge certain aspects of play. And my point is that you can still use those maps to practice, but the overall theme of playing consciously enough to be able to recognize the mistakes that you're making is still equally valid here. And on a similar note, you mentioned that Osu is not really a game where you really need to think super consciously about strategy and those sorts of things. Like there's not that much to think about. And on a similar note, I think it is really tricky because you have to think deeply enough to recognize what you might be doing wrong, but you can't think too deeply that you start to overthink everything that you're doing. And a lot of this really comes down to the concept of automaticity, basically, which is basically this concept that once you've learned a skill, then your brain is able to perform that skill unconsciously. And the idea is basically that when you're relatively new to a skill, then you have to like think about every movement sort of consciously and like figure out muscle memory and all those sorts of things. But once that skill starts to get more developed, it gets stored differently in the brain and you're able to perform that activity much more fluidly and cleanly and more importantly, unconsciously. And what overthinking really leads to is, and this is especially common if you are nervous or basically if you don't trust yourself, that you try to take conscious control over your actions. But especially in a very skill-based game like Osu, that can be really dangerous because your conscious abilities are not actually very good. And your conscious brain doesn't have nearly as many resources to work with. And so you'll probably like lose track of things or like just brain fart, a random simple pattern. Those sorts of things tend to be really common. And unfortunately, I don't know why we are wired this way, but that tends to happen in the most high stakes situations. So if you're on a run that you don't want to mess up, or if you are in a tournament, for example, that tends to be really common, unfortunately. But yeah, my point, especially with overthinking, is that it's definitely a dichotomy to be balanced. You don't want to be too far on either side. And when we talk about playing consciously, what we're really talking about is recognizing what you're doing wrong and knowing what exactly to focus on. But aside from that, I think to a certain extent, you really need to be able to trust yourself at a certain point once you've developed that skill. And again, as I mentioned, like when you're really early on in developing a skill, then you can't really activate this unconscious playing. So it's also really dangerous to try going on autopilot too early, because if you try autopiloting to skill that you haven't developed yet, then you are just going to keep making the same mistake. And most importantly, you're not going to be recognizing what mistake you're making. And so that, I think, is really where that cycle of playing so many hours and not really getting any improvement out of it, that's where that can really start to happen.
I did not know automaticity was a word. That is so good. I was looking for that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's like it's kind of like the whole thing I've been kind of thinking about in my last couple of months of like playing this game. And okay, I don't want to like gas myself up, but like rapidly improving.
Right.
I just want to like reiterate what you said before too. Like while like your play session of Osu shouldn't be autopilot, it should be at least in the topic of improvement. Like if you want to have fun, have fun.
Right, right, right.
In the topic of improvement, like be conscious of what you played throughout your session and what mistakes you make. But as for like the whole like playing an Osu map part, Xylus, if you know who Xylus is,
Oh yes, top
he
Canadian speed player.
yes, sir. He actually tells me that he plays most maps and he plays the best when he's autopiloting. And he actually struggled in Valorant because he defaulted to autopiloting in that game first.
Oh, like as a beginner?
Yes.
I see.
Well, he did have a background in CS, so he was able to like instantly like,
Oh,
shoot up to gold.
that's tricky.
But then he started getting stuck around there because he wasn't consciously thinking too much of like, oh, what the enemy might be doing or like how close am I to like ult, stuff like that. And I think Osu is unique in that like it's a much more linear game. You have much more room to autopilot once you're like there's not too many outcomes, basically. Autopiloting is much more rewarding when you've played certain patterns through and through that your body can instantly recognize it and you don't have to consciously think about it. Um,
Right.
and I think Xylus, who is like a pretty decorated tournament player, I'd like to say, plays tournaments mostly like autopiloting. Of course, like nerves still exist, but because he's played so many maps that have had like similar patterns, he's able to play more effectively through autopiloting. As for me, I also think about this a lot where oh wait, this is gonna be ironic. I think about this a lot where I don't think when I play Osu. Some of my plays, the less I think, the better I'm able to do. However, this doesn't work for like newer stuff that I'm not accustomed to, like tech maps, which tend to be the most tricky for me. If I'm playing unconsciously, I might like shit miss a entire like 10 note pattern because I've never really registered it in my muscles before, I guess.
Right. Yeah, you've never really encountered that pattern before.
Yeah. So I think like this whole like brain off, brain on thing has been something I've been thinking about as I play the game. Especially for farm maps. Like when I play farm maps, I tend to be brain off. And I think like there's also the thing about like why people miss in like Kai sections or like hard parts of a map.
Right.
I think it's common to like as you're like going closer to the chorus of a song, your nerves tend to build up and you start to think about the pattern more when the pattern could be like super rudimentary. It could just be jumps. But
Oh,
like
yep.
yeah, but if you're like too uber conscious of it, you'll be using like the wrong side of the brain to hit those jumps, I feel like.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
like there's more uncertainty.
That's interesting you brought up like the song, like the hypeness of the song can actually really impact the way that you read the patterns. I've found that if anyone has ever tried either playing with music off or changing the MP3 of a song, of a map to something else, it's really interesting because the parts that you remember in that map as being the most difficult, you sometimes don't even realize are there in the first place. And you just kind of play them and move on. But I think it's a lot of perceived difficulty actually comes from the context of the song that's playing rather than the actual patterns.
Yeah, and I also think like if you've ever like made a practice diff and FC'd it a billion times,
Oh,
but
yeah.
couldn't do it throughout like the song playthrough. It's something to think about as to like why you missed. Was it your nerves that built up that led you to think consciously of the pattern, or did you just miss? Like there could be a lot of reasons for a miss, and I think one of the big ones for me is just like being too conscious of the pattern when I should really just be aiming it confidently, like any regular part of the song.
Going back to the thing about practice diffs, I think it was Doomy who first said this. He's like a top Australian player. And I
Oh,
definitely,
he plays Maple Story. He's sick.
oh, yeah, he's definitely a beast. I think he said once that like a pattern in a practice diff and then that same pattern in the actual map is actually two different patterns.
I see where you're coming from here, right? It's like first of all, like there's like a bunch of things that may be different, like the displacement of your hand because of like the earlier notes that you haven't played, or your nerves, or what your brain is thinking when the song plays. Like there's a lot of different factors that I think that could correlate to you hitting a practice diff song pattern and the actual pattern on the song.
You know what that actually reminds me of is I don't know if you've ever played chess or like those chess puzzles where like if you end up in a certain board state in an actual game and then if you do a puzzle of that same exact board state, it kind of feels different. It's just the context of the like overall state of what you're looking at. When you're just doing it as a puzzle, you sort of take in the information of the entire board state at the same time and it's all equally sort of fresh in your mind. Whereas if you're doing it in an actual game, there's sort of more context of like what the other person's intentions were and like the order that they move their pieces and things like that. So I'm not sure if it's quite a one-to-one comparison, but yeah, that definitely came to mind.
Yeah, I definitely see you there. Like when you play an actual chess game, well, I'm not great at chess, so I'm just gonna assume.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you'll sometimes think, okay, I have sacrificed this many pieces. This might not be the wisest move or something like that. Well, I don't know if like actual chess grandmasters think that way. But like there's a definite stakes thing that affects your mindset going into things.
What this really reminds me of is, I think, a sort of general theme that I'm noticing about all of this is like not trying to control things that have happened in the past. And there's a term called the sunk cost fallacy, where the more you've invested in something, the more you want to try like seeing it through to the end, even if it's not the best idea objectively anymore. And that sort of seems like a common thing that we're mentioning, especially when you mentioned the whole chess thing, where like based on how you felt about the moves that you made before, that starts to become a determining factor in your strategy moving forward, instead of being able to realign yourself with the current state of things and being able to make slightly more objective and, I guess, level-headed decisions.
When I was getting coached for Valorant, like the thing my coach told me at least was like how influential mindset is. Like you may be getting overwhelmed by like your losses and what you've sacrificed getting to your current point in the match, but having your head space always in the what I should do on a regular basis sort of thing is like really key to at least winning games when it comes to games I've played like Valorant or Fortnite. Like keep your fundamentals in mind. Like counter strafe, shoot 4 bullets, not more than that, or else your spray goes haywire.
Right.
I know it's like a little, it's almost like I'm like spurting out jargon right now, but like bottom line, sticking true to your fundamentals in like distressing, nerve-wracking moments is beneficial. I think in the long run.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I want to go back to the point you made about building habits, especially in the context of building it up from like small scale situations and getting really comfortable and like sort of having that intuition until you're able to put things on autopilot. When you mentioned that, it sort of made me think of like in general, like philosophies around habit building, like just in life, where if you want to build a new habit, it's best to anchor it around another habit that you already have. A common example is usually brushing your teeth or just your general morning routine. Another common example would be like if you commute somewhere regularly, like if you have to be somewhere at a certain time, then that's also a very like reliable anchor or part of your day that you can build other habits off of. So if you want to start exercising regularly or studying regularly, then you try to anchor it either before or after that other habit that you already have, and like basically building up from habits that you've already developed until you are able to have a more, I guess, complex or robust habit system that you've built for yourself.
Yeah, I think that actually relates to video games pretty well. Like even though it's like a more of like a lifestyle type of thing, definitely relates to video games. And what I've told some people that ask me for tips on improving like at whatever it is, I often just say, okay, so let's break this down into steps of what you can control first. How's your sleep schedule? And then they'll be like, oh, 2 a.m., 6 a.m., uh, 12, like I think what I like to do whenever like I feel like I'm out of whack or not feeling myself is to fix what I can easily fix first, and then I can anchor into the next thing.
Right.
Like what you said,
Yeah.
like I'll fix my sleep schedule, and then okay, I'm not being productive enough. How about we start our morning, talking with I don't know editors or whatnot to check my video progress, and then I've done 2 things, and then like the rest of the day might be bad, but then we'll start like building that habit so that we don't spend as much like of our like battery thinking about it, and then like eventually we'll be back into I guess homeostasis in terms of productivity, like something like that in
Right.
terms of yeah.
I never really realized how connected these sort of concepts of building habits can be, sort of relating it to many different topics.
My friend's like a gym buff, is that the word for them?
Yeah, 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 that's a term.
He was telling me how like related Osu was to working out. In terms of like how to like kind of almost like physical slash mentally improve. Like you will play the game. I think you did a study on this, like playing the game and taking a break. It's
Oh,
like very
yeah.
similar to working out. Cause he used to be close to 3 digit. And how he would play the game is similar to how he would go to gym. Like he'd play the game like 4 days and then take a break for his to let his muscles like, do its thing. I don't know, like gym stuff.
Right.
And then he'd go back at it. And then like he improved faster than I did, to say the least.
Oh, wow.
And I think it was like as a good thought to think about. Like how you should play Osu is comparable to like working out.
Reminds me of your burnout theory.
I actually made that with him.
Oh, really?
And it's not the most is like we are like high school kids. We didn't really know how to articulate it well, but like it's like the thought we came up with.
I think it's a cool way to conceptualize it. Whether or not that's the most scientific way to understand how it works is a different question, but I think that form of conceptualizing it, I think it doesn't really matter how you think about it as long as you sort of have this general principle that like putting in practice and then taking a break and letting yourself sort of allow that skill that you've developed to really settle into yourself. And then once you get back in and de-rest a little bit, then you usually are able to break past your previous peak performance.
Yeah. That is the principle of like I guess bodybuilding too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of comparisons between Osu and just sort of working out in general, especially the physical aspect, sort of speed, stamina, that sort of thing is usually where I hear those analogies the most. But I think it's interesting you brought up that there's a sort of mental aspect to it as well. I feel like confidence is something that is really important when it comes to any skill-based activity, really, but really where like you have to trust yourself that you have the abilities to exert your all and give all of your energy to perform a certain task. And I think if you start to either not trust yourself or just generally chicken out of really committing all of your abilities to something, then I think you usually end up with worse performance in that sense. So yeah, just a thought that came to mind, especially with confidence and how I think that also definitely relates to exercise in general.
I want to expand on like the whole confidence thing. I don't know who I had this conversation with, but like very recently, we were talking about how a lot of players will feel like, I was watching your Legit Korea podcast.
Oh.
Yeah. A lot of players like they feel like they're incapable of like learning a certain skill because they tried it once and they're like, "Oh, I am absolutely terrible at this." It's like the thing like they don't want to take those steps back and feel the shame of being awful at something in order to learn about it. And you'll notice with a lot of like players that have pop offs, they usually break some sort of barrier, like let's say the 400 pp barrier or the 700 pp barrier. And once they break it, they are able to just poop out so many scores of similar caliber because they've, I'd like to say, broken a mental barrier they had.
Oh, for
of
sure.
not being able to do that.
For sure. I want to bring up a term called the banister effect, which is basically that concept. So the term comes from the first person to run a 4-minute mile, something like that, where for a long time in the running scene, there was this sort of mental barrier on running a 4-minute mile. And then after one person did it, the barrier was broken many, many times very soon after that. And it was named the banister effect, I think, after the person who first broke that barrier. But the concept sort of illustrates that there definitely seems to be these mental barriers around what is considered to be possible. And I remember talking to Vaxi about this, where he mentioned that like, if you are able to put yourself maybe 5 years in the future and sort of think about like how many barriers that exist now are probably going to be like a complete joke over there in the future. And you can even think of this in the context of yourself when you're playing, is that let's say you're at the 400 pp barrier, for example. And if you think about, let's say if you keep practicing for 5 more years, like you might be just setting 700s left and right. And this barrier, whatever barrier you might be at now, it's only there because of where you are in the timeline, if that makes sense. Sort of a meta way to think about it. But the point is that like if you're able to look past any barriers that sort of put this subjective barricade around certain accomplishments, I think that really opens up some really powerful mindsets around performance.
When you were talking about like the whole like thinking of yourself 5 years in the future thing, is that like a way around it, or like what can overcome the banister effect?
I would say there's two main ways to do it. One is by recognizing that other people have broken that barrier many times in the past. And so in reality, it's only a barrier that you're imposing on yourself because you yourself have never accomplished that, when in reality, it's clearly something that many other people have done in the past. And if that's the case, then you definitely can do it too. That's just kind of how things work. And the other context is, let's say you're Emmerich, for example, and you're at like the 1200 pp barrier. And if we look back maybe like 5 years when it was like 700 pp scores, 800 pp scores that were like crazy, wild, like top of OC game Reddit sorts of plays, and then compare that to like what people think about 800 pp scores these days, and sort of how like those same sorts of trends tend to happen no matter what. If we look at speedrunning communities, for example, that trend tends to always happen as well, where like people will feel like the record can never get much lower than this. And then like some new strategy comes out, or like people just get really crazy good at the game.
Right.
And like the barrier gets broken many, many more times to the point where that old record that people thought was so immortal is sort of like a time that a very casual player could get. Those sorts of things where like if you sort of recognize that like whatever barrier exists now is definitely going to be perceived much differently in the future. If you're able to pretend that your mindset is that far in the future as well, there's like really powerful mindsets that can come from that. On a similar note, just because talking about that just reminded me of this, I think it's called like negative visualization, but I'll try to explain this really quickly because it's a sort of similar mindset thing around like putting yourself in future you's shoes. Let's say something really, really bad happened to you. And if it's the first time that that happened to you, then it's like, oh, like really, really bad. And like you might feel really bad about it, you might be sad about it for a long time. But then hypothetically, imagine if that same bad thing happened to you 1,000 times. By the 1,000th time, you're probably not going to have nearly the same reaction. You're probably just going to brush it off as just like something that happens. And you just sort of move on. Like you probably won't even think about it within 10 more minutes. And the idea is that if you're able to put yourself in the shoes of the person who has had that happen to them 1,000 times, and you're able to have that reaction the very first time. Because like if you can come to that conclusion about the same exact situation after the 1,000th time, then you should in theory be able to come to that same conclusion after the first time that bad thing happens. And as a result of that, you should be able to have much less like negative reactions to things that happen around you. And just sort of simple, but I think pretty effective trick when it comes to not sort of getting in your head about like little things in life.
Yeah, I think that mindset also allows you to fall into a growth mindset like much easily. If you know like it really won't be that bad, like when you are worrying about something, when you are anxious about something, you'll be able to be like, "Oh, okay, it wasn't that bad. Let's move on. Let's see how we can improve next." Is a much more plausible thought to you, and I think it'll come to you a lot faster if you begin to adopt that sort of thinking. It's a good, really good point.
Yeah, yeah. Especially you're able to focus more on the like more productive questions of like, okay, and then what should we do next from here instead of which I mean I'm not trying to sound like this like emotionless creature. 'Cause I definitely think
Yeah.
there's a time and place for like mourning and being sad over things, but for especially sort of little things that tend to happen, like let's say like you got mud on your shoes. I don't know, something kind of simple like that. I think those are really situations where like being able to apply that mindset or principle can be really, really helpful.
I was thinking of when you were explaining the whole thing, I was like, "Oh shit, what about heartbreak?
Oh, yeah.
What if you're just completely emotionless? You're like, "Alright, that ain't nothing. That's next." But that's kind of an admirable sort of mindset to have sometimes. Like if of course like a relationship can be very, very like important to someone, and
Yeah.
then suddenly something happens like, "Oh no, he cheated."
All right.
Um I think like the initial like feeling will be god awful, but then to adopt that sort of thinking like when you are ready to move on will accelerate the moving on process. Like, yeah, I'm gonna bounce back from this, bro.
Yeah.
Can't trust these. Oh, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. That reminds me of the concept of like go next. There's a time and place for it for sure. I definitely think if it's something like I don't know, loss of a loved one or like relationship breakup or something like that, where I think there's definitely a time and place where like it's healthy and like part of the like moving on process is like being able to emotionally process the whole situation, but and like really, at least in my opinion, like really take lessons from whatever happened. The idea is, at least the way I see it, is like it's not really about the outcome, but it's about who you become in the process. And so, with that in mind, it is definitely really important to, I think, grow as much as you can from everything that happens to you. So, at least that's sort of how I see it. That way of thinking has seemed to serve me well thus far.
Yeah, that's a very, very admirable thinking process. I think at least for that whole, was there a name for this? Like that sort
Oh,
of thinking.
I've heard it called negative visualization, but then when I looked it up, I couldn't find anything else about it. But that's basically what I've heard it called. You're talking
I
about
guess
like
like
putting yourself in the shoes of when it happened to you 1,000 times.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guess like in terms of like time and place, it's like there are some times where using your logos would be more wise, and then other times where like in terms of like thinking
right.
where your mind should be, sometimes like your pathos should be more prevalent, and then other times when you're ready to face the situation, so to speak,
Yeah,
you should use more logos.
yeah, yeah.
That was already quite interesting
Yeah,
to
yeah.
think about. I might have to take notes myself.
So a lot of people know you for making skits that feature very spontaneous humor. In your opinion, where does creativity come from? What are the main characteristics of creative people, and how can one enhance their creativity?
All right. So first was, where does creativity come from? Is that what
Right,
you asked?
right.
Um, I used to make a joke a lot where, well, I guess it was like a recurring tweet where I would tweet on my Osu Twitter account, Kariyu 101, by the way, haha, self promo, daily dump log. I would take a dump and I would come out of that dump with an idea. I think like we're in a very like sort of attention dichotomy. I don't know. Is that right? I don't
um,
know.
Attention epidemic.
Sort of. Where like we're always like I sound like a boomer right now, but like we're always on our phones and we're always like just trying to see what's gonna happen like on Twitter or whatever, or like what's happening with our friends. I think boredom, just doing your business, taking a shower, that's a lot of time to like reflect and think of ideas that I think like a lot of creative people, at least when they suffer from like sort of blockage, need to experience. There's a reason why like taking a walk could be so gratifying to people and such like a mental clear, because when you're taking a walk, your mind is free to wander without like the constraints of like look at your Twitter notifications, or look at your Instagram notifications. You have you and your brain, and that allows you to just wander and make the most have the most wild thoughts. That's why like shower thoughts exist,
Right.
because people are in like their element. They're more prone to making like just creative abominations in their mind, I guess. And one more thing I'd like to add on to, I get a lot of creativity just from watching people in my field, or that means it's not creative, it's not original. But I get a lot of inspiration from watching people in my field. Like while I did like just denounce the whole people be on their phones thing, like watching TikToks or watching like successful content creators gives me a lot of ideas of what I can do for myself. It's kind of like that whole like, oh, have a conscious Osu session. I'm having a conscious YouTube session.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like consuming content, but specifically with an open mind to
Right,
like
right.
sort of not even exactly what jokes they're making, although that's also something, but even like the editing style or like the type of video or premise or sort of anything in between, and sort of being able to take bits and pieces that you like from many different types of content, and especially being able to put all those together. I think yeah, when you mentioned boredom in particular, or like having time where you're not necessarily consuming content, so at least this is what I've heard, is you sort of have two main like modes of thinking when it comes to like information consumption. You have a mode of thinking for taking in information from others, and then you have a mode for sort of processing that information within your own brain. This is basically what I've heard, is that like your brain really takes it seriously when you are consuming information from someone else, because that's sort of the whole transferring of knowledge and ideas and information. But the thing is that equally important, and I guess even more important to emphasize in modern culture, is taking the time to process all of the information that is sort of coming at you and like really digest it within your own brain. And the vast majority of people, and I think this is kind of what you were talking about, is like people generally don't give themselves any time to focus on that themselves. There's a lot of basically constant stimulation and content consumption, which is good. I think there's obviously a place for that, but this is where things like meditation and just generally like having time to yourself to think is something that's very there's sort of like a movement of people that really try to prioritize that stuff, and like especially in the context of mental wellness, but I think in general with creativity it's equally important. And like you said, taking a walk, more specifically with your phone not with you. Yeah, and this is even where, like, let's say when you're falling asleep, I think that's like the most prime moment where like you're really not doing anything, like your eyes are completely closed and you're not moving, you're not having any sort of stimulation, and that's really where your brain is like, okay, like it finally has time to think about all these like random thoughts that have been popping up, and like
Ooh,
just
yeah. Yeah, that's a
general,
good one.
yeah, like just unresolved thoughts basically. I think some thoughts like take a while to just process and think through. Your brain is really designed to come up with ideas, or it's really, I think a better way to describe it is it's sort of a prediction machine. And so it tries to, it's really good at like coming up with hypotheticals. For better or worse, it likes coming up with hypotheticals of bad things that could happen, so that the theory, the theory is that then it can prepare itself for that. If that situation ends up happening, then like you sort of practice what you would do to make sure that you survive, basically. So whether a feature or a bug, I think it's a feature, but definitely a part of our brains. But yeah, and I think just to touch on meditation again, I think that's a term that's it feels very like woo, sort of like it gets relatively misunderstood, but I think it's just a blanket term for like being with your own thoughts. At least that's sort of how I conceptualize it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's like this is like I guess the most colloquial way to put it by like speaking like this. It's like being in your own head. It's just like
Yeah, yeah.
your own element, your mental space. We're not in that sort of space for a long time because of like, whether it be like, human interaction or like particularly like just the whole phones thing. You've made me think about like what I think about when I that period of time before I sleep.
Yeah.
And I realized I've also gotten like a good chunk of ideas from there where like I'll be almost about to fall asleep and I like randomly I shivered because like, oh shit, I just got a sick idea. So I'll whip out my phone, write it down, and go back to bed.
Yep.
That sort of like time to ourselves, I think we should value more for just like better well-being, of course, and also the creativity aspect is also like it's also there.
Yeah, and I think boredom is especially something that, how do I put this? Fear of boredom is something that I think is really at the core of, or it's somewhat innate. I mean, it's somewhat painful to be bored. Like you would rather be doing anything else than being bored, basically. But I think it's really one of the main factors in like this whole like always wanting to be consuming something or stimulated by something. And yeah, I know a lot of people talk about how being okay with being bored is actually really, really powerful for honestly a lot of things. Obviously, creativity, like we're talking about, but even in general, like motivation, productivity, beating procrastination is something that, like, the thing with boredom is that basically how engaging something is very relative to other things that you've been doing. If you've been like playing video games all day, then like relative to that, like doing homework is like you feel like you'd rather do anything else than do your homework. And on the contrary, if you sat in a blank room with absolutely nothing to do for 10 hours, then you would rather do your homework in that moment than do anything else. I feel like.
Yeah, that's a torture machine.
Yeah. So yeah, I think in short, being more accepting of boredom is something that's really, really powerful. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. I definitely would not have thought of that.
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is like don't necessarily dread the let's say 8-hour wait for a passport at the DMV or something. Or just kind of look forward to, what you could think about when you are bored. It's boring, but like some really important things come from being bored.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a part of life.
For sure. And I think like getting into it is the most painful part because you're more adapted to being overstimulated than anything else. But I think once you get comfortable with like experimenting with the thoughts and information that you already have in your brain and like sort of practicing like connecting them in like more unique ways can be really, really powerful.
And yeah, one more thing, just for like the whole boredom thing. When you tend to be bored, you're probably in a safe spot with no threats, I'd like to say,
Oh yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
So your prediction machine or your brain, rather than gravitating to like the negative things that could happen, your prediction machine has more time to make what ifs of like actual like productive thoughts. Like, oh, what if I worked with this person? I don't know. I would have this thought while I was like waiting for my flight or something. Or like, what if I take my content this way? Okay, let's
Right.
explore what it could be this way, and that's where your creativity could start.
Right. And I do want to mention because I think that's a good point. When it comes to like processing negative things that have happened to you, you ever have like those times where like you're just falling asleep and then like just minding your own business and then like random unwanted negative thought of something bad that happened to you that like you never really fully processed and like resolved.
Yep, that's what keeps me awake.
Doesn't even really need to be trauma, but it's like that sort of thing. I think like at first, if you try doing this, if you feel like you have a lot of that sort of like buried trauma or like bad things that happen, then like those will sort of start to like resurface, and then that can be like really, I think, anxiety inducing maybe. But basically, those are just thoughts that like your brain has to like sit with and finish processing, and then like once you've finished like really thinking through it and processing it, then like it will start to bubble up less and less. And so personally, I haven't really reached this point, but what I've heard reported is that at a certain point, if you like sit down to just like be with your own thoughts, you'll notice that at first you might have all this like random stuff from the past bubbling up, but at some point, if you've resolved everything, then the only stuff that will pop up is like what you're going to do later today, what you're going to do tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
And so that's when like your brain has been like, it's like jailbreaking your brain. um, and you're able to like really work most creatively with the thoughts that are in there.
Yeah, we've definitely kept the ball up for a little bit, but I think it's that important of a topic.
Yeah.
Like throughout the day, when you're not bored, that sort of stress and anxiety-inducing thoughts that your prediction machine can make will put a coil on you. It'll definitely like kind of restrict your movement throughout the day. You'll feel less of your brain being used to like do your activities and more like spent on these negative thoughts. But when you use that time of like boredom of like that time before bed, that time where you're like waiting for commute or some stuff like that, just to spend time to like resolve any troubles in your head. I think you'll find yourself in a clearer headspace when you do need your brain most.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Oh, that was good.
Yeah,
That
dang.
was good.
Let's go. So, regarding your content, again, I think aside from your very engaging sense of humor, one thing that I've noticed you do really well, especially in your videos, is the storytelling aspect. In your opinion, what are some of the key elements or principles that make a good story?
Oh, I actually started adopting this whole storytelling thing like 3-ish months ago. I realized like my sort of like video style in the past was more of like a one-shot manga almost. Like this is some funny idea I have and I did it. But like a lot of it lacked like a storyline. So I started, like what any content creator would do. How to make videos engaging on YouTube. I started watching a lot more videos with storylines. And these are like, let's say big name people like Ryan Trahan, who's recently did like the
Yep.
delivering a penny to Mr. Beast. That's a 30-day storyline. That is probably one of the most successful YouTube series I've seen. We have like the Mr. Beast, of course, gold example of a YouTuber that makes storylines or
Right.
challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
Now the whole challenges, like the whole meta of YouTube right now is challenges. I'm not a crazy fan on it, but I like it. Like I like doing it, and my formula for it is kind of like my niche as a channel so far has been kind of like doing good in video games and being funny. Sorry, I don't want to
Right.
be like
No, you're good. You're good.
overbearing with I know I'm talking my book here, but yeah, so I would like think of like a problem like let's say, oh, people don't really see video games as a valid hobby. Particularly parents don't really see video games as a hobby. I was
Yeah.
like, okay, that could be a minor problem. When I was growing up, I did have a bedtime. I wasn't allowed to play with my DS at like 11 p.m. Didn't stop me though, under the covers.
So true.
Um,
Sorry, mom.
and I think like it was same. I got caught once. It was bad.
Oh.
It's like when I noticed this, I was like, okay, what if we compared video games to, I don't know, playing the piano? They're both hobbies, and you could probably improve at a faster pace when you have someone pointing out your mistakes, like a coach. And I think that's a wonderful story to tell, and it's something I'm definitely passionate about. Video games and improving, that's my sauce. And stuff like that. Like I think it's like the whole problem solving thing. It's like, what problem do you want to tackle next, Kariyu? I would think in my head, and it'd be like, oh, play more. The play more epidemic. Everybody and their moms asking what play more means. Let's try structuring Osu into like, I don't know, some sort of like workout routine, where we just work on skill sets. It gets you less thinking of like, oh, why am I doing this wrong? It just makes you start just playing the game more in a kind of more like challenge fashion. Makes it more fun. It's kind of where I've been with like my storytelling formula. We'll take a problem and we'll find like a creative way to tackle the problem.
Right, right. That's especially interesting. I think the way that you've been able to like connect different concepts like workout routine and sort of basically being like, how can I apply this to Osu, and like how can this fit as like a content idea or like a video idea. And I watched that video. I think the like I made a routine for Osu. I think that's the video you're referring to.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that one is, I think, really well made, and especially I think the whole like narration aspect of like connecting all the clips to each other. I think that's something that you've done a really good job with. What are some mistakes, I guess, or issues that you see some people make with, I guess, stories in the context of a video specifically? On a similar topic, I want to add that like watching other people's content for inspiration on what you should do is obviously really important, like we've talked about, or really for anything like a skill-based thing or something like that. But equally important, I think, is looking out for aspects of content that you definitely don't like, and like more importantly, if you're able to recognize some of those things in your own content and like realizing that like when you see it in other people's content, like you really don't like it, and being able to reflect on like if there's anything that you actually do that's similar in your own content and improving based on noticing things that you don't really like about other people's content. Basically, learning what to avoid is equally, if not more important than learning what to do.
Um, This is a hard question. The thing is, I don't feel like I'm in the most prime position to necessarily criticize people at it because I feel like I haven't like been close at all to mastering it yet. It's still something I'm experimenting with. But I guess big mistake is maybe people not necessarily full sending it. I can't really answer your question because I don't tend to, at least when I watch videos, I don't tend to have like a, oh, I do not want to do this because I tend to
Right.
be open-minded. But I do want to say that no, this is super broad. Full send your ideas, even if they don't work. It's always a good experience because you'll know what not to do next. And I think the amount of storytelling in the OSU community is kind of low.
That's true for sure.
But that's all I can offer on in regards to like this topic, I guess.
I think that's actually a pretty good answer regardless, because I think what that really speaks to is that no matter whose content you're watching, there's always aspects of it that you can take from that you think are pretty good and sort of potentially consider in your own content as well. Or just in general, I think like there to some extent is no real such thing as like good content or bad content necessarily. I think there's just sort of different styles. There's some types of videos where it's literally just someone who like just picks up their phone and just records like a random thought that comes to mind, and then they just like, you know, no recording or no editing, maybe like 2 minutes long, and they just post it. And those videos sometimes like do really, really well as well. So just sort of like stream of consciousness type thoughts can sometimes be really insightful. But I think that's definitely a equally valid answer that you gave.
Mhm. There's actually something that I don't stand by this all the time, but I think what people can look to as like a great way to start storytelling, at least for content wise, is like if you're doing some sort of challenge or something, don't make it just a challenge. See what you can adopt from that challenge or use in your everyday life to really make that video like genuine. Like I made a routine for Osu. While I don't follow like a specific set of routine anymore, it's just like not it can't fit my time slot well. I still have days where I'll focus on particular skill sets, and that's what kind of my videos about, like focusing on those particular skill sets. And like let's say another storytelling video I have, like sort of oh, I paid for coaching. Be open to spending money on your hobby if improvement is one of your goals. So I guess like overarching what I want to say is like don't let your videos just be a video to be a video, you know? Like let it like represent your lifestyle. Is that a bad
I think that's definitely a powerful message that people can take away for sure. I think being able to put more of not even just your personality, but sort of your own style into all the videos that you make can be really powerful. Obviously, from a content strategy perspective, but also just for like from the viewer's perspective, like being able to connect more with a certain creator and like really be more engaged in their content in general. I think that's definitely an important lesson.
as cliche as this sounds, like content creating is my lifestyle right now. And like being able to make things that I apply to my own life and share them is what makes me most happy, I guess, when it comes to content creating.
I think a really important lesson, sort of in general, when it comes to anything that involves other people, basically, is that like people are really good at sniffing out intent. Like if someone is really being genuine or not. I think that's something that's sort of like baked into our like abilities as like societal creatures. But like being able to tell if someone is trying to dupe you or not, that's something that people are really, really good at. And I think that really shouldn't be underestimated. But just in the context of what you're talking about, like if you are sharing something that you personally like actually use in your day to day and can really show not only that like it works for you, but like you're not just sort of speaking out of thin air, basically. Like it's genuinely something that you do, and that's why you're sharing it, because you genuinely feel that it's what works, as opposed to I can teach you how to get rich, buy my course and I'll teach you that sort of thing. So
Right.
like there's certain types of content that or like messages that you can send out where it completely diminishes or like nullifies anything that you're saying, just like by the nature of the message that you're sending. So
It's like saying you should try this setting. This setting changed my life. This area is crazy. I said it's the best area for everybody. Something like that. Like you could kind of tell like they really want to like bait you into sort of getting that, oh my god, this area is crazy. I got to try it.
right.
But like rather than like, I did full area, but I don't like I'm not going to like shill it. Like I'm not going to like say, "Oh, this is like this made me into a demon, a genius. It's just like it's just something I like to try. I think it was a very cool challenge, and it ended up being part of my play style, and I think that's cool. That's like kind of like the whole beauty of making videos. Like there are so many directions you could take it, and yeah, the whole genuinity of the content is super important for I think long term and your enjoyability of making the content.
Oh, for sure. And I think long term is also something that came to mind for me because it's like in the short term, especially in the context of say marketing, for example, like you can squeeze out some numbers if you really need to with some either like clickbait or like really fancy wording or like over the top sales like scripts. Not really sales, but you get the idea. But I think really where like long term trust in either a brand, including personal brand, right? I think that really comes from just being genuine and genuinely offering something of value that people can appreciate and want to come back for more.
hmm And for me, admittedly, I'm not like some all good being, right? I've also made some clickbait videos in the past, like this routine got me like $250 or something. It really I didn't really follow that routine. This was like 3 years ago playing Fortnite. I just randomly won some money with my friends, and I was like, okay, let's just bait it.
All right.
Um, I think like in retrospect now, those are my least favorite creations, and there is a small amount of guilt, not too much, but like it's something I'm not the most proud of, and it's like something I don't want to ever like really be what I'm known for. And I think that's like what goes for anybody who is trying to get into a hobby such as this in like kind of like a creative field. Make stuff that you can be proud about, regardless of like how they do. It is really a cliche to think about, but it is even wherever you are on this like whole scale of content creation, whether it be like 10 million subs or five, it's always something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful lesson, I think is, or if nothing else, just a rule of thumb that if you wouldn't watch your own video, then I think that that's like a good litmus test for like if you should even really upload it in the first place. Honestly, I think it's a good litmus test for anything in general.
Yeah, I just didn't want people to be like too confused, like this sort of proudness thing with like being embarrassed about like let's say watching your own video. Don't be embarrassed to watch your own video. Like
Oh, that's right.
I think we all hate our own voice and everything. That's like a human thing
Yeah,
almost.
yeah, it is.
Like don't be afraid to watch your own VODs. You can learn so much from them in terms of streaming. Like
Oh, yes. I think that's like one of the classic bits of advice for improving as a streamer is going back to your VOD and like literally watching it as if you're a viewer. And like at what points do you just like have this urge to click off? Because like chances are the people watching got that same urge, but they actually clicked off. And so
yeah.
that can be a really big problem. On a similar note, when it comes to content creation, what are your thoughts on risk in general? Maybe both in the context of playing a game or just in a creative pursuit. What do you think is the role of risk in those activities?
So let's start with the creative part first, since we were just talking about videos. I think I'm more in like that sort of mind space right now.
Right.
I think it comes with experience in creating videos. Like I think I could speak for a lot of content creators that initially blew up and then started like plateauing because they were kind of afraid of like trying new things. Like they were like, "Oh, holy crap, the first time this happened, my Osu clip blew up. Now I'm going to upload 15 clips that are the same thing because that's what worked. That's what got me here." I think that trap is what people often fall into. Risks are very part of content creation, I'd like to think. And speaking in like a general sense, you decide what you want to be. Like I'm gonna speak in the context of my channel real quick.
Okay.
And back to that whole like blowing up thing. I blew up on Fortnite and Fortnite parodies. And not the thing I'm most proud about, I will say. There are some videos I think that are golden, but otherwise there was a point where I started being like very complacent of like what I had. So I just wanted to keep giving my audience, whatever was meta, like whatever it was like whatever got me where I was in the first place, like some Fortnite parodies, some like montages here and there. And even though like some of the numbers were crazy, like at least to me, in relative to me, at some point I realized that I definitely should have taken the risk of stopping that sort of content sooner for like my mental one and for my passion. Like, it didn't make sense for me to keep making, like, mundane videos if I wasn't going to be putting my all into it, like, back to the whole, like, genuinity thing, and it was made clear to me when I could no longer just, like, look at my content and be, like, proud of it. So, how this plays into risk is, like, there is demand in any game. However, there are, like, clear potentials and, like, sometimes caps for games, such as, like, if you wanted to move to, let's say, making CS:GO content, that game has been around for a long time with relatively few changes, and as a result, it's, like, already saturated market. Is, like, is that a market you want to risk your time getting into, or is it not worth the risk? You always have to, like, spend time to think about it. And that's all stuff you have to weigh in when you are a gaming content creator and even just content creators in general. I think there's two sorts of ways you can go about to pivoting content. There's a more risk heavy route where if there's like a trend you want to get to now, you can hard pivot, just like a lot of creators with Among Us, which can either be a super rewarding move or a detrimental one. Or I think there's one where I employed where I slowly moved my content away from Fortnite, still giving it some time to compete and play, but I would phase out into Valorant and whatnot. The substance here is basically be aware of what you're getting into. I think there's no wrong answer besides not giving it the thought. Like it's always important to see all opportunities.
Yeah, I think if I had to put it in my own words, that there is no wrong answer as long as it's something that you're really passionate for.
Yep.
I feel like this general sentiment really applies to like choosing careers in general, or even just hard pivoting careers. Because obviously we're talking in the context of like streaming in different categories, but I feel like the same concept sort of applies if you're thinking of like hard pivoting your career or something like that. That there's obviously this transitional period, but at the end of the day, if it's something that you're passionate about, then I think even if you're getting slightly less money, for example, switching careers, then I think at the end of the day, if it's something you're most passionate about and if it's what is most true to you, then I think that's really what matters the most.
Yeah. Like doubt and like fear of the unknown will come. Like I think that's natural. Like fear is a natural feeling. And initially I was like scared of like if I was and I'm speaking about the future and like if I'm not able to make this a career. I'm not scared of failing anymore to make this a career because in the end like wherever I'll be, there's always my love for content in the first place. And I don't think like there is a world where I will ever just like not be around this like space. And it makes me happy regardless of like where I am in this like whole spectrum of content creators from like the bottom to top to just be in it. And recognizing where your passion and values lie is important. So I think we were getting to risk with we talking about gaming now?
Right. Like there's also risk in the context of making a play in a game. Oh, first of all, like in isolation, what are your thoughts on that? And then also, how do you think that sort of risk can compare or relate to the other kind of risk that we were talking about?
When it comes to risk in video games, at least amongst the ones that I've played, it's always a very it's usually, I mean, it's usually a very short amount of time for you to make a decision that decides a lot basically. It's like we're getting more specific here, like should I buy a sniper and glass cannon it with no armor or should I play it safe and play it like we've been playing? I think what drives my like attitude towards risks a lot is like the sunk cost fallacy. um I often will think, okay, if this game decides whether I win like a lot of money or not, I will probably risk wait, what the heck? Do I think this way? Um, you know what? I just thought about it. I don't really have a surefire attitude towards
Oh,
um
wait, can you repeat
like
that? You like cut out when you said that.
yeah, sorry, my AC might be doing something. I also need some time. I'm getting phlegm in my throat. Happens
Oh,
when I talk
you're
about
good.
um I don't have a surefire attitude when it comes to risk. It's a lot sometimes based on like mood, environment, maybe even like the people I'm playing with. I remember back in Fortnite competitive, I was at the highest I've ever been in terms of like professional status. Not that I was like professional. I think I was like, if you could consider me, you could consider me a semi pro. And I had the opportunity to become pro. And at the time, Fortnite was in like a squad sort of setting. Like all the competitions were squad based and there were 4 people. I tended to be the soft spoken one in the group, and the guys in there were very vocal with like I know any mistakes or concerns that were made. And I ended up taking a lot less risks because I was scared of getting yelled at. And like holistically, this is probably like, I don't know, childhood experiences built up. And this is what ended up happening. And that is like an occasion where I felt that risk was too scary for me. As I moved games and got away from that sort of space, I was able to recognize more of like how much that didn't matter. Like in retrospect, like if they yelled at me, who sorry, who fucking cares, right? So as I grew up, I realized that risks, like it's always good to be open to that like risk taking mindset if there is good reason for it. So when I did get into Valorant, which can be comparable to chess in that there are sacrifices you can make, like you can bait a teammate or oh, that's not the nicest thing. You can bait a teammate or glass canyon an operator. I started to see the appeal of taking risks because I started seeing less of the repercussions as a problem. I think legit Korea mentioned this on a previous podcast you did with him, where some pro could make a absolutely crazy play, but let's say he screwed that play up, he could be either like the hero of Reddit or the absolute laughing stock of Reddit.
Yeah. Just a related saying that I've heard is that like the better it can be, the worse it can be. I think that really applies here.
hmm Like, there's huge potential on both sides of you either being the hero of a game or absolutely killing it. And I think that this is where risk ties in a lot to what you make of the failure that could happen. And this is why I think like when you are playing more casual forms of competitive like ranked games, you make the most absurd plays. Well, don't in your teammates.
Yeah, yeah.
But like you have a lot of room to make absurd plays, so you know sort of how it will go in a high stakes environment. That's why like a lot of like the very flashy players in let's say super competitive games like VCT, LCS are flashy like in regular ranked games and just casual games. It's because they've tested that risk so many times in ranked games that they can justify making like an absurd play in a high stakes environment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely does. I think there's a lot of limit testing and more specifically, I think learning and growth that comes with taking risks. I think, and this applies really to any domain, I would say, but I think when you take a risk, really what you're doing is creating a situation where you are not completely confident in what the outcome will be. And you might take it anyway with the hope that there will be a positive end result, but there could very equally be something negative that happens instead. And I think we can probably define a risk as like doing something where you are not completely confident if the result will be positive or negative. And usually it's done in the context where you feel like the potential positive result of that risk would be better than the safer sort of lower risk, lower reward option. But I really think that what you're really doing when you take a risk is you're delving into the unknown and discovering what's out there, for lack of a better term, learning a lot either about yourself or the limits of your skill set, or if you're just playing a game, then like the mechanics of how things work. And like if you are X levels above your opponent, like are you able to make a certain play that you otherwise wouldn't be able to if you were at like equal strength at that point in the game? And I think really risk allows you to grow a lot. And I would relate this mostly to beginner's mindset, where beginner's mindset is basically like when you're a beginner, you sort of expect failure as the default result because obviously you're a beginner and you're bad, and most likely whatever you do is going to result in messing up. But really, I think like this is just sort of a general thought that I have, that mistakes or failure in a general sense, I think those are concepts that are they have a negative reputation when I believe they in reality should have either neutral or positive, because really it's just a window for you to learn and grow. But especially in the context of risk with even things like content creation, where at first you may have been doing something out of pure passion. Like you make one video just randomly out of passion and then it really blows up. And then from there, you sort of have to make this choice where do you want to continue basically milking that format, or do you want to continue making things just out of pure passion, regardless of if that might perform as well? And I think that's also on a similar note. I think in the context maybe of just society in general, where older people in general tend to be more fixed in their ways because they feel that they've done all their mistake making and risk taking when they were younger, and they've learned what to do and what not to do, and they are much more like risk averse and try not to do anything that could have negative repercussions for one reason or another. But I really think that, especially if you're a seasoned player or seasoned, just generally someone who's very experienced with something, I think it's even more important to be able to allow yourself to take risks and put yourself in situations where you can really learn a lot more about what's out there, unknowns that you may not have known before, and just generally being able to learn a lot and grow a lot as a person.
Yeah, I like that point. Kind of reminds me of like basketball in terms of like how, what you said about how older people are risk reverse. It's just like, let's just say basketball is an example, but this applies for like most fields in general. We'll have a more like rigid, sort of less risk, I know what I'm doing sort of style of doing their thing, because they've made their mistakes as a rookie, and now that they're decorated, they can continue to be confident in what sort of output they have. I think that pattern is it certainly exists, and there are exceptions, but I don't know where I was going with it, but it's something to think about.
No, I think there's a lot of games out there, especially sports, where the strategy has sort of become stale over the years. And basically, like as a collective player base, people experiment with what usually tends to work and then what doesn't work. And from there, people find a certain strategy or way of playing that works better than anything else that they've tested so far. Keyword being just strategies that they've tested so far, because obviously there's many more out there. But I think that can lead to a lot of games sort of becoming stale. And obviously, when games grow stale, or really anything, I think that's really where like viewer engagement starts to fall off as well, because it's just like, well, why am I even watching this if you are able to actually predict what's going to happen? But and on a similar note, when some like basically newcomer sort of comes along with fresh mindset or like new ideas or new strategies, basically with like innovative strategies that are able to really like shake up the whole meta in general, I think that's really where like there's a lot of excitement from communities in general, and like that's really where growth in general comes from, I would say. And on a similar note, I think that concept also applies with generally in society, especially when it comes to like policy making and things like that, where there's like huge generational divides. And I hear this often mentioned even in the context of like science and research in general, or just like any advancement of an academic field, where people that have been around for a very long time, sometimes they have like very deep rooted beliefs about how things work. And in order for a field to really grow and develop, it's sometimes not about bringing new ideas in, but rather a lot of it has to do with sort of having the old generations move out from the field and sort of take their old limiting beliefs with them, so that the new ideas have room to grow and sort of basically fix the old like limiting mindsets that people had in the past and really grow as a society. But yeah, unfortunately, I would say that like development in a lot of different fields or just different domains in general, I think gets stagnated, not because there is a lack of new ideas, but it's because people are too adamant about their false limiting beliefs, that especially the people that are in power, because those are the people that generally have been around for the longest, the most senior position people. Unfortunately, I think like it's very easy to fall into this trap of trying to only stick with beliefs that you feel have been working for you, rather than being open-minded to new ideas that are out there.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of on that topic. It's like what you learn as a child ends up etched into you for the rest of your life.
Oh,
And I
that's a good
think
point. Yeah.
and I think a golden rule as a society is, even if there are things that seem wacky, is to just always let your brain think about it. Like be open-minded enough to give that thought some excitement, or to entertain it,
Oh,
basically.
yes, yes. There's this saying that goes, we question all of our beliefs except for those that we truly believe and those we never think to question.
You repeat that?
We question all of our beliefs except the ones we truly believe and those we never think to question. Like we question our beliefs usually, but we all have beliefs that we like genuinely really like we really believe, and then those we never think to question. This is more of a lighthearted example that I remember happened to me and made me think of this quote. But when you open a banana, you open it from the peel, right? And I was with a friend, and they were opening a banana, and they just like casually opened it from like the bottom, and
Oh, what the heck?
I was like, I gave them this like look, and they're like, "What?" And then I was like, "Have I been wrong this whole time?" Or like, because like the instinct is like, "Why are you opening it wrong?" But then it's like, maybe I'm wrong. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like, have I been wrong this whole time opening a banana from like the top, basically? And like they described it as like they're opening it from the bottom, so like they knew that it was the bottom, right? It's isn't like they felt like
Right.
that was the top of the banana.
Mhm.
But still, I think like that was definitely a belief that like it's a simple example, and obviously there's more like deeper beliefs that people have, but the same sort of principle applies where there are beliefs we have that like we truly believe to the point that we don't even think to question them. And I think that's really where, if you're able to open yourself up to questioning your beliefs, that's really where you're able to grow. If nothing else, even if you don't change your beliefs necessarily, because it's not like you have to change all your beliefs, but at
Right.
the very least, being able to reflect on them. And I think a lot of people try to avoid content where people are discussing opposite viewpoints of what they themselves have. But I feel like those are actually really valuable bits of content to consume, because if nothing else, it strengthens, like it opens your mind to criticisms towards that specific viewpoint that you have. And so either you start to, you practice being able to defend your own viewpoint and strengthening your belief as to why you think that it's true, or potentially you're able to change your way of thinking and actually change your beliefs if you feel like they're actually not serving you as well as you thought they were.
Mhm. I can't really articulate anything well in this sort of regard, but it's like when you do like argue the other side, you're able to do like the topic in general, you get so much more insight and knowledge about. That's super valuable.
Right,
Um,
for sure.
where did we? How did Risk come to this again?
It was about like
Oh, being open to just like the most abstract idea
yeah.
and weighing in like oh okay, but there was no weighing it in part. I see. Well, we could also end it there. I think that's
Yeah,
a nice point to end
I
on,
think that's good.
like the whole open-minded thing.
Yeah. Um, so what are some lessons that you've learned about understanding your role on a team, be it in the context of like Valorant, Fortnite, or OSU teams, or something else, or in general, basically, anything about understanding your role on a team?
The one thing is recognizing your strength, and that comes with like being open to trying out new things, seeing like if you are better as a IGL or in-game leader in competitive aspects or better as a role player. And that comes with seeing how you play in competitive settings, seeing how you do high pressure environments. Basically, I ask myself like, what can I do that generates the most efficient output? And that basically just comes with playing the game. So like in, let's say, Valorant, in high elo, I'll try playing a smoke character, and I realize that whenever I am like playing Phil as like either a smoke or a sentinel, that my output as a person or as a player is not good. I'm not good at like communicating well, and that's what those agents tend to do. So what I started switching up to was like being focused on being the best like duelist slash more of like the high octane, high APM agents and less talking, more doing.
Mm.
um, and that allowed me to figure out my role in the team for that regard. And in Osu, I think what I provide is some sort of, I'm gonna use Ed as an example here.
BTMC?
What Ed can bring, yep, what BTMC can bring to, let's say, an OWC team, besides the fact like he's good at Nomad 2s or whatever, he's a general good consistency player, is like he brings the morale of the team up. He brings the chemistry up because he's just a very charismatic and open person. And at least for my OSU teams or like the few tournaments I've played, I tried to make the whole thing fun. If there's someone like being fun. I'll be fun with them. I'm less of a leader and more of someone that can like, offer my thoughts on picks and, lighten the mood a bit. And I kind of just immediately fit into that role once I realized it.
When you mentioned like there's some people that work better as in-game leaders basically, and then some people that are better as role players, I think like being able to understand your role on a team is especially important, not just for you to know what you're supposed to do, but also to understand what you're not supposed to do. And I think very commonly people feel like they are supposed to basically be responsible for things that are not actually related to their role.
Yep.
And I remember you mentioned this in your video when you were being coached in Valorant, where understanding what everyone else's role is gives you a much clearer picture of what you're actually supposed to do as well, and being able to work around what everyone else is basically expected to be doing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think if there was one thing that I had to mention for this is that like understanding what you're not supposed to do, given your role in a team, is equally important as what you are supposed to do. So you can really, really specialize and give that, 120% and shine at your specific role.
Right. Because when you do find like a miscommunication with like other players with different roles, if you have the knowledge of their role, then you can also like tell them what you expect from them, and you guys can bounce ideas off of each other until you guys find like the perfect combination. So being able to learn what you're not supposed to do is a good way to just amplify the amount of growth you can do as well when you're not playing. The general thing I want to go with here is like when you know what you're not supposed to do, you can grow faster, but I don't know how to back up that with reasoning.
Oh, I see. Well, I think it's because like yeah, when you're practicing, basically, if you know what not to basically waste your time focusing on when you practice, then that allows you to have much more fruitful benefits out of when you practice or when you're trying to get better at your specific role. Although I would also say that like it helps to have experience with like doing the task of the other people on your team and like practicing doing their role as well, so that you start to get a really, really thorough understanding of like how they work and like their strengths and weaknesses and like their tendencies as well. I think is really important.
Right. You start to understand like the limit of help they could provide you, and in turn, you can also know what you can do as your own role for them, and it'll make your practice or growth a lot more efficient.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a really good point with like yeah, honestly, yeah, I think that's probably like one of the most important things is like learning what the limits are of the rest of your team and like learning what they actually can't provide for you will help a lot, because I think there can often be and here I'm even just talking like in a general sense with teams like in a project or like work or just something like that, where like you expect someone else to be able to do something for you, but in fact it's like not really their role. I think actually this came to mind right after I said that, but what comes to mind is like customer service where a lot of people expect customer service people to be able to do much more than they actually can, and I think that leads to a lot of messy situations.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, I think that's a really good point where like it allows you more empathy for the other people on your team and really being able to understand what their perspective looks like and what their capabilities are, so that you can really learn how to work around them much better than someone who has only ever experienced their specific role.
I like this conversation. It's like we're going full circle back to the whole like open-minded thing. It kind of ties in.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you have any tips for beginners, whether it be in a game that you've played or just sort of in general, any tips that you feel like beginners of an activity should keep in mind?
Do not be afraid of embarrassing yourself by being bad. That's one mistake I made during Fortnite competitive, where the keybinds that I had were not necessarily optimal. I would screw up a lot of simple like edits and builds when I was playing competitively, but keep in mind I was a content creator, right? I stream to some viewers. I would make videos for viewers. I didn't want to look bad in front of them. So I did not switch to keybinds that could have helped my growth a lot more. And so the takeaway here, even in like games like Osu, if you want to like get good at tech, but you are god awful, don't be afraid of starting at like 4.5 stars if you regularly play 6. And that was, I think, what helped my growth so much going into full area was that when I switched my area, I didn't play the same maps that I did. Not saying that you shouldn't do that, but I switched to full area and went back to like 4 to 5 stars. And I'd like to think that doing that strengthened my game so much more now. than if I were to just go right into trying to be the best I can without taking a break. It's like what you said in the previous podcast, or what Willie said. Take a step back sometimes. Don't be afraid to do that. If there are like glaring mistakes, do not be afraid of, you know, not being at your best. And I think, let's see. Oh, holy crap, dude! Take progress videos, progress pictures.
Oh,
Just like working out, like seeing how far you've come is it's such a feeling. It's such a good feeling, dude.
yeah, yeah.
Like you might not notice how much you've improved from like 1 month to the next until you really start looking at like older videos. And I really wish I took videos of myself playing Osu in like 2014 because Jesus Christ, man, that was bad.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. In some games, I think like Ozu actually does a really good job of like keeping track of things for you, basically, where like your old scores are like always there on your profile, and like if you have your local scores, you could always watch the replay. But yeah, I mean, even then, I think for Ozu specifically, like if you're able to make videos of you actually playing, those are really really fun to look back to. But yeah, just to touch back on, there's two things that you mentioned that I think are really good. One is like not being afraid of making mistakes when you're a beginner. And I think if I can expand on that, like I think also equally important is like not getting rid of that mindset as you improve. Basically like keeping that beginner's mindset even as you become better. Because I think that's really where people start to feel like they're now good enough to where like they're not someone who makes mistakes anymore. Like you said, if you're generally playing 6-star maps in Osu and then you want to start learning tech and you can't even play like a mid 4-star map of that, like then that's fine. That's just where your skill level is, right? And I think allowing yourself to be okay with where you are currently and sort of start taking steps towards where you want to be. I think the most limiting thing is what you think other people will think of you. I think that's sort of probably a more generalizable statement than might seem at first glance, but yeah, I think if you're able to really get past that, that it opens up so many more opportunities to grow because you're not limiting yourself by being afraid of getting better at something because you're bad at it now. It's like I'll start going to the gym after I'm super fit. Then it's like, what?
Yeah, that's a fallacy right there.
Yes, exactly. And then the other thing, if I had to expand on, is like the settings that you choose. I think it can be tempting to want to stick with the settings that you chose when you were a beginner. But the way I like to describe this is that, and this applies even for general plan setting, is that the settings that you chose when you were a beginner were the settings that you chose when you knew the least about that activity and when you had the least experience with what worked and what didn't. And so, with that in mind, I think choosing a tablet area on day one and then sticking with it and then not wanting to change it even 8 years later is kind of like you chose your college major when you were 5 years old, and now that you're doing college apps, it's like you're still committing to that. I mean, it might still be good for you, obviously. But I think being able to be a bit more open-minded with what you chose when you were a beginner and allowing yourself to adapt those plans as you gain more experience in that field is really, really powerful. Because I think it's actually relatively common for people to not want to change something that they started with. But yeah, if you're able to work on that, I think that's also something that's really, really powerful to keep in mind, both as a beginner to like not get too caught up on like what are the perfect settings, because it's not like if you choose your settings now, then like you'll never be able to change them. Like you can just press escape, usually go to your options and change it. So yeah, I think those are definitely 2 points that I think were really good. A lot of people worry when they feel like changing their mouse sensitivity or tablet area, for example. It's like, oh, but if it doesn't work, then like now I'll be stuck in limbo because now I'm not used to anything anymore. And it's like, in reality, like seriously, worst case is you switch and you try it for a little bit, and then if it doesn't work, then you can go back to your old area. It might take a day or two to adapt back to it if you've been experimenting around, but what you'll end up with is you'll be back on an area that's more comfortable for you. And on top of that, you'll have the experience and confidence in knowing that you tried something else and it just didn't work out as well for you. And you won't have to live with this sort of uncertainty or regret that you never tried something that could have, in theory, been better. And in some sense, that really goes back to risk taking as well. I think the principles are definitely related there. Like being willing to try something just for the lesson that you learn from it, rather than worrying about what the outcome will be. Because yeah, again, at the end of the day, it's really about what you learn in the process of the things that you do.
Mhm. I used to make a lot of like aim training videos because I used to use Kovacs and AimLab a lot. And then people would always ask like, "Oh, what's the perfect sensitivity?" Or like, "Oh, will I lose my muscle memory or something if I switch?" I know this sounds weird, but I think for like even like a game like Osu or like Valorant, you switching your settings doesn't necessarily kill off your muscle memory. You still register in your mind that you need a certain range of motion to hit a target. And that's why I feel like the whole like perfect sensitivity thing is kind of BS. Like I think professionals in games can do good on most settings. Like they play on the sensitivity that's most comfortable for them. But in terms of like executing what they want to do, their experience already does that for them. So don't over convolute your thoughts of whether switching to the sensitivity will like lose my muscle memory or anything. It's whichever like setting you choose, you will get better at the game with time.
I think it's kind of ironic. So I happen to have your like Twitch stream page open right now. Even though you're offline. So
Uh-oh.
I was grabbing your socials, and
Right.
so I can see your offline chat, and
Oh my fuck.
someone just tried doing a command for your aim lab sensitivity in particular. Well, so um, so you have a command for your sensitivity, and then
Mhm.
the command shows your exact sensitivity for Apex, Fortnite, and Valorant, and Osu. And
Yeah,
then
here's the funny thing. All of them aren't accurate anymore because I've changed.
oh,
It's like I feel like there's even like Radiant players that change their sends like once a day. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Does Cookies he changes area often or
oh,
used to?
he does. He's known for that.
Yeah, like
He'll like
it's
micro adjust his area within a session.
it's like these guys are crazy at the video game and they're not necessarily losing their muscle memory when they change the sense. Like the range of motion stays consistent, I'd like to think. Like your mind and your hand will adapt quickly. And I think there's like we could also get into like the whole can of worms of like, oh, is changing your sense good because you'll be more aware, you'll be more conscious of like learning.
Yeah.
But like back to like the main point, like don't worry about like perfect sense and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's I almost want to relate it to like okay, I don't know how this analogy will land, but it's like if you always do your essays in a certain font, and then it's like if you change the font, then it's like are you not going to be able to read it anymore? And it's like the letters are the same, they might look a little different, but at the end of the day, it's like the concept of what each of those letters are is still there within you. And so like if you change your sensitivity or something like that, like in a game, then you might have to adapt a little bit, but like at the end of the day, like the concept of like your movements relative to each other are still going to be the same, basically.
Yep. I think that's a good analogy to sum it up on.
All right. So other than what we've talked about so far, do you feel like there's any lessons that someone who doesn't play a certain game could take away from a game that you've played? Like any lessons that a non-Osu player could take from Osu or non-Valorant players from Valorant or something like that?
Most games I've played are super different, but like the fundamental mindset for all of them are like uniform. It's like play consciously, unless like your goal is not to improve. It's like even if your goal is like not improving, winning is obviously better, right?
No, it's so true.
so so don't just rage queue. It is an easy thing to fall on, but even if you do rage queue with your brain on. If your goal is to wind down and just chill, sure you can autopilot. But like there's so much more growth to be had whenever you are playing a game and noticing patterns. Like the whole patterns thing, it's like oh my god, oh my brain is getting crazy. Okay, so like time for a child is longer than time relative to adults, right? There's
Oh,
an
like perceived length of time
right.
is faster, or it's slower in babies or younger children than for older people.
Right, because as a child, you are more. There's just so many things to discover. Everything is cool. Everything. Wow, something cool just happened. What the heck is this? What is this? I think like kind of be like a child when you play video games, which is kind of like the point of video games is to have fun, but also like have fun discovering patterns, have fun discovering like new things as you go, or new things about yourself and your play style as you go. And it's just instantly much better than just autopiloting, going to your next game because you lost and just yeah.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's so much more fulfillment to be had out of being curious, basically, and trying to just sort of absorb everything about the environment around you and really, yeah, really questioning why things are the way they are. I think that's definitely the sort of childlike curiosity that is really, really powerful, especially if you can maintain that or nurture that as you develop. As a slightly unrelated question, do you feel like rage queuing is a concept that can be applied to real life in some way?
Yeah. Um, like why live your life completely? Well, there's some people that do prefer 9 to 5s, but you could spice up that 9 to 5 with like just like being more curious, like seeing your life more through like a child's lens, and like every day there's something new. Every day there's something you can discover. It all like relates to this entire discussion of like open-mindedness. That's like your life will be a lot more exciting if you choose to make it less mundane and be curious.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I would add on, I think be careful not to live your life possessed by negative emotions. I think that's something that's really tricky. And I think you could relate that to like when you're playing games as well. Like if you're like tilted or something like that, or just generally in like a bad or like something has sort of put you off. I think it really helps to I guess this is like a natural reaction that a lot of people do anyway, but I think it's still worth mentioning that like you should take some time to yourself and sort of trying to continue bashing your head against the wall basically. When things start to feel repetitive, I think be careful not to let unconscious just getting in the motions sort of take over yourself that much.
Mhm. And one more thing in regards to like letting your negative emotions control you. Same thing for players starting up in games or content creators. Don't let like, jealousy take over you, or don't let like one hateful comment get the better of you. If anything, if you are bothered by it, just hate grind.
Oh, true.
It's like you could take like let's say someone says something, "Oh, you'll never be a top player." Yeah, in spite of them, start grinding. Fuck them.
So true.
That's kind of what I've been doing. Yeah, it's just a lot of fun. A lot more fun when like, oh yeah, back to like the whole like beginning. Let's say you like just started off in Osu. Don't aspire to necessarily be Emrek. You can be inspired by him, but like, don't try to be him. Be your own player. Like, do whatever the hell you want.
Oh yeah, that's especially tricky. I remember in this specific context, it may have just been something that came to me naturally, but I remember when I was a beginner, like I obviously understood there were people playing like 5, 6 stars, which was like impossible to me. Even 3 stars was like way too fast for me at the time. But
Mhm.
like I sort of understood that like there is a natural skill growth development to this game, and like at the time, I remember like consciously being very aware that like I was at the level of playing 2 stars because I was very new to the game and I was still sort of getting used to the mechanics. But and I'm glad you brought up things like jealousy and comparison, because taking inspiration from like the best of the best is one thing, but it's really dangerous to compare yourself to people that have put in that many years of experience, especially when you don't have the luxury of looking back through exactly how long and like the struggles that it took that person and like the countless hundreds of thousands of hours of practice it took that person to get to where they are now. It's like your first moment of seeing that person is that they're an absolute god at the game or whatever it is. And to you, within that same amount of exposure time, your own abilities are obviously a brand new beginner. And then their abilities after seeing them for 10 minutes is like crazy good. And so I think like it can be really easy to get warped perceptions of how quickly people should improve. I would almost honestly relate this to like social media and how it sort of warps expectations of like how your life should feel or how good it should be. Because like if you go on social media, like the thing is that like somewhere out there someone is having the best day of their life and they are sharing about it on social media, and so like not everyone is having like a super perfect day every single day of their life, but somewhere out there within your social media feed like someone's post will come up from like their unique day of having a really special day, and that can be really dangerous because you personally are experiencing all of your monotonous days and days that are just not as exciting as the people you're seeing online. But the thing is that like their days aren't all that special either. You know those memes that's like the picture you post on like LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Tinder.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's like people frame themselves in different ways also too, and I think that's something that you need to be careful about. That like my point is really just about like your expectations of how good your performance should be, and just sort of a warning, if nothing else, like be careful not to get baited by the flashiness of what you see out there, because everyone struggles, everyone takes time and blood, sweat, and tears to improve at things. And I think if you are able to put that same sort of work in yourself, then you'll be very surprised how much you can improve.
Right. Like, I think this comparison is like easily made for like, let's say a gaming montage slash highlights video. You'll be like, damn, This guy does not miss.
Yeah.
He just missed like 1,000 times off camera.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's just like Instagram. Like, yo, I'm at the round table. Next day, I'm fucking like, I don't know. I'm eating like a hot pocket on the couch, and like I stayed in bed for like 7 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, don't focus on like the highlights of everybody. Everybody has had some struggle in some form to get where they are.
Yeah, and it's like roundtable, and then like people are at like Anime North, and then there's like people are at COE, and it's
Right.
like it's all different people, but like in your perspective, it's like it's all coming out at you, and then you're like, well, why is my life so boring in comparison to like all this stuff that I'm seeing? It's like, yeah, I think it's a natural thought process, which is why we're sort of bringing it up. But if you're able to recognize it and catch yourself when you do that, then I think that's really, really powerful.
Oh shoot! There's one more thing.
Okay.
Sorry. Content creators, don't worry about your viewer count. Hide that shit.
There's this really good saying I heard recently. It's like, just because it's easy to quantify doesn't mean it's important.
Yeah, I like that. Like let's say I'm doing like OSU profile reviews. My viewers might go up, let's say 40%, right? But like it's not like these guys are people that will stay. It's not like these guys are people that will regularly engage with me later. So especially to the people that are starting out, look to make like that one or two people that come in, be very nice to them and create a lasting bond with them. Don't worry about like doing a OSU supporter giveaway and then you'll have 10 viewers and then they all disappear when you're done.
Yeah. It's like you can squeeze numbers, but when it really comes to building a community that's true to you, that's really where like you should be okay with having lower numbers, as long as you know that it means that the people that are there are people that really do appreciate the content that you're putting out there.
Yes, sir. Focus on the love that you get from your existing community and continue to grow that.
Yeah, I think focus on the love. I think that's a good take-home lesson to wrap this all up. So
Hey.
yes, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. This is really fun.
Yep, I think this was really insightful for me too.
Let's go. And yes, thank you.
Goodbye.